Of Quran by Fatima.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان. الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة ونخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان خلق الإنسان من صلصال كالفخار وخلق الجان من مارج من نار فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان رب المشرقين ورب المغربين فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان صدق الله العلي العظيم.
We're very fortunate to have Shaykh Mohamed Yasin Devji, who will be speaking to us on the Shahadat of Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salam. Welcome to Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Shaykh Mohamed Yasin is studied in the Seminaries of Qom and Syria for many years. He has a BA in Islamic philosophy and mysticism, and his areas of interest include Transcendental philosophy, Islamic mysticism, Qur'anic tafsir, and spiritual psychology. We're very fortunate to have him speak on this topic today on the Shahadat of Imam Muhammad Baqir. Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين سيما خاتمهم وأفضلهم محمد مصطفى صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق أولم يكف بربك أنه على كل شيء شهيد صدق الله العلي العظيم. My elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, we're going to do things a little differently, so I will ask you to indulge me for a few minutes. Get yourselves comfortable in your seats and just relax with me. And we'll begin by closing your eyes or softening your gaze, and we'll go through a small exercise to get ready before we carry on. So, recite a salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So as you're seated there, I want you to take some time and focus on your breathing. Really pay attention to your breathing. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. And while you're breathing, I'd like you to really take the opportunity to feel your breathing in the back of your throat, in your head, in your chest, down to your diaphragm, And really focus on your breathing and allow your breathing to overtake your entire physical being, right up until your extremities. Really focus on your breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. And while you're breathing, what I'd like you to do is bring in front of your mind's eye two qualities about yourself. One quality that you like about yourself, and one quality that you don't like about yourself. Bring it in front of your mind's eye and pay attention to those two qualities. They can take the shape of a solid, a liquid, a gas, a color, the letters, could be anything. And take a moment to step away from these two qualities and look at these two qualities. And pay very close attention to what you feel when you look at these two qualities, including your bodily sensations. And now that you've brought these things in front of your mind's eyes, I want you to shift the focus back onto yourself, away from these two qualities. Shift the focus back on yourself and look at these two qualities from the perspective of a loving observer, without judgment, without anything, just a loving observer. And really take a moment to tap into yourself. And again, make note of how you feel when you tap into yourself as a loving observer, looking at these qualities. Keep note of the bodily sensations and the kinds of things that you feel. Really focus on that breathing and keep focusing on that breathing. Your breathing is your stability in this exercise. And inshallah, slowly, once you're ready, continue with your breathing and slowly allow yourself to come back into the room. Please recite a salat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So make a note of that exercise because we will come back to it later on in our talk. I'd like to ask you a question. How many of you have heard the narration? I'll recite it in Arabic and then I'll give the English translation. Utlubul ilm walau bisin. Seek for knowledge even until China. Just with a show of hands. How many of you heard this narration? Most of you. So let me ask you. Who is this narration attributed to? Can anyone answer me? Prophet? Prophet? Okay. It's interesting. This particular narration, when I was growing up, I only heard this part of the narration because apparently there's a second part of the narration. And I always thought that it was attributed to the Prophet because that's how it was taught to me. The actual full narration is Utlubul ilm wa huwa ilmul ma'rifatun nafs wa fihi ma'rifatur rabb azza wa jal. Meaning, seek for knowledge even if in China. And this knowledge is knowledge of the self, and in this knowledge is ma'rifah of the Lord. So that's the full narration. The interesting thing is that in the Sunni Hadith corpus, only the first part of the narration is attributed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in our text, the entire narration is attributed to Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullahi wasallam. So, the question of our identity encompasses a vast array of details. Each person is distinctly unique, beautiful in their natural state, and flawed in diverse ways. No two individuals are the same. No two individuals look the same, and everyone lives uniquely, shaped by their upbringing, faith, knowledge, culture, and life's experiences. In this vast world that we live in, there are competing demands and numerous temptations. It is essential to develop a self-awareness self-awareness for emotional well-being and spiritual survival. We are complex beings with many layers. And by enhancing our self-awareness, we are able to then advance in understanding of our behaviors and the underlying reasons for our fears, hopes, and motivations. I would actually argue here that knowing oneself, leading to awareness and to know more of God, sits at the foundation of it all. There are many exegeses and commentaries found in various Islamic scientific disciplines that have explored knowledge of the self being knowledge of God. However, we're not going to delve into those right now. And the reason why is that these exegeses and commentaries have been written at a very high level. Unfortunately, in my upbringing, in listening to these exegeses, they are presented in a way which I found inaccessible. The example I will give is as-salat mi'rajul mu'min. Yani the salah is the mi'raj of the ascension of the believer. While looking at this particular narration that was attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, I discovered that it actually is not even a narration from the Prophet. And I found it difficult, and I understand why I found it difficult, is because the way it was framed to me is that I'm down here and the Lord is all the way up here. And knowing myself and looking at myself, I look up and say, you know what, man, I ain't getting there. There's no way I'm getting there. So in looking at these things and looking at other concepts, especially in the Quran, when we look at the seven types of people that Allah specifically talks about, that He loves, they are who? They are the muttaqeen, the sabirin, the mutawakkilin. They have been presented, again, this is my experience, they've been presented in a way that have been very inaccessible. And so what I try to do, or what we try to do rather, is to bring them down to make them accessible. Because the reality is that all these qualities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks in the Quran already exist inside of us on a level. And there's no better place to start to develop ourselves than to be able to access these things, which then serves to be a starting point as we move in our journey. If we go back to the narration, we can look at it in a number of ways. First, which is the most literal, and that is that, okay, we look at the narration and we go back to when the narration was given. And looking at it literally, the Amir is saying, seek for knowledge, even if it's in China, and that is the knowledge of the self, which will then give knowledge of the Lord. So looking at it literally within that context, perhaps we can look at it and think, okay, well, what was going on in China at that time? Is it that there were practices in China and that part of the world that they were practicing that facilitated and allowed us to gain knowledge of ourselves, which would then gain knowledge of the Lord? That's one perspective. The other way, and the second way to look at it, and the way we will be looking at it, is more through a metaphorical way. And that is perhaps to realize that what the Imam is saying is that knowledge of the self or its ways are not limited by time and place. This interpretation, based on my own personal reflection, then opens the ways for an entire horizon of possibilities, not limited to aforementioned time or space. Unfortunately, again, the way I was raised and continued my own discovery, there wasn't any room for even self-discovery, let alone discovery of God is something else. Discovery of God was limited to what? Was limited to madrasa, was limited to the centers, and if I wasn't lazy, in my prayers. There really was no opportunity or space for self-discovery, let alone self-discovery that led to knowing God Himself. But now, in the spirit of looking at this horizon that are open to us, there are a plethora of possibilities we can explore. But firstly, we have to establish the premise of knowing oneself being equal to, or a facilitator to knowing God. First, in order to do this, we have to establish what connects this knowledge of the self to knowledge of God. The most basic thing that ties us to God is something called our fitrah. The fitrah is our innate connection to God. And as my brother and colleague, Sheikh Zuhair, who is a son of this community, very nicely puts it, it is the hard wiring inside of us. It's what makes us human, and it is what makes us connected to God. Every human being in creation, irrespective of creed, ethnicity, religion, wherever they come from, has a fitrah. Everybody. You understand? Now, let's go back to the meditation. The meditation exercise that I went through with you was an opportunity to connect back to the self that is free of everything. Free of judgment, free of vices, free of virtues. And if you were able to connect, then perhaps you might have gotten a glimpse at your own fitra. A glimpse of your own fitra. Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who founded the analytical philosophy, says, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." This resonates for me because the fitra is not something that can be killed off. It's always there. And as my late teacher used to say, your fitra is either asleep or it's awake. If it's awake, the connection to God is strong, and if it's asleep, the connection to God not so strong. So that's the first premise of establishing the connection between knowledge of the self and knowledge of God. Second is based on the mystical premise that all of creation, including ourselves, are the collection of the manifestations of God's divine names and attributes. We can then begin to reflect on what names perhaps resonate with us and how they begin to understand what is resonating with us at a high level and what is resonating on a low level, on a very basic plane. There are other premises we can explore and establish, but we'll suffice it for these two for now in the interest of time. So now, as we begin to look at these premises, a picture begins to emerge, and this picture is called the human being. A human being does not live in a vacuum. Rather, a human being lives in a world and with other human beings. As such, because we occupy physical body, we are bound by time and space. An interesting thing begins to happen. So far, that myself and Sheikh Zohair cannot existentially sit in the exact same seat, something begins to happen. And that is that because we are bound by time and space in the physical world, it is the world of conflict. And that conflict, translated through the psychotherapeutic lens and psychological lens, is known as trauma. Each and every one of us experiences trauma. Trauma is one of those things that whether it's major or whether it's minor, we are all affected by it. Trauma is one of those things that is not limited to the moment we experience it. Rather, its effects can last much longer and can even be passed down from generation to the next generation. What makes things more complicated is that trauma, when passed down, gets compounded two ways. The first way so I'll give you an example. The example is of, let's take Zaid, for example. Zaid has grown up and he has experienced trauma in his life. It could be major trauma, it could be minor trauma. That trauma affects Zaid on a psychological level and on a physiological level, right? So he's been psychologically affected by that trauma, and he's been physically affected by that trauma. Zaid then carries on his life. He goes through his trauma, he carries on living his life, and then he meets Maryam. Maryam has lived through life as well too, and she's also experienced trauma. And she carries it psychologically, she carries it physiologically. Okay? Zaid and Maryam get married. Zaid and Maryam get married and they give birth to Ali. Now, the physiological factors that affect a person who has been through trauma then are now part of that person's genetic code. Right? So you know how when you go to the doctor and you have a problem, doctor will ask you, is there something hereditary? Is heart condition in your family, liver disease in your family, kidney disease in your family, these type of things, gastrointestinal, you name it, right? These physiological things that are created inside of us are now become part of our genetics. You come together, and now physiologically the effects of that trauma gets passed on to Ali, who is born. Okay, so that's one passing down of the trauma. Then, if Zaid and Maryam haven't dealt with their trauma, they continue living the effects of that trauma and raise Ali, so that now he's affected psychologically, not by one factor, but by two parents, and he lives his own trauma. And the cycle continues. and the cycle continues. Please recite a salawat. It's interesting. How many, do we have any mental health professionals in the audience? So to our mental health professionals, thank you very much, and Allah bless you for being such an integral part of the healing journeys that people face in their life. Being a mental health professional is not an easy job by any stretch. So I appreciate you and I thank you. What's interesting is that when trauma is not dealt with, it gets passed on generationally. And as it gets passed on generationally, it then becomes something that becomes a part of a family unit. When that family unit then gets together with another family unit, gets together with another family unit, gets together with another family unit, you now have a collection of families who have unhealed trauma. What does that do? Now you have a community of trauma. You understand? Now again, this is not to say, we're not talking about, the type of trauma where, someone is murdered and you witness it, or you witness a heinous crime, or you're a victim of a heinous crime. No, it could be something as simple as when you were a child, you were bullied. Understand? This is what they call small t trauma. But even that has an effect and goes a long way towards shaping your personality and how you deal with situations later on in life, right? So now you have a community. You have a community of unhealed people. Looking at the audience here, I know my parents were, and I'm sure many of you were migrated here from East Africa or the subcontinent. That migration came with its own trauma because you had to come here. Most of you probably had nothing. You had to establish yourself. You faced the difficulties of economically establishing yourself. Then you had, on top of that, the difficulty of establishing yourself within the wider society. So it could be racism, it could be prejudice, it could be all these things. But you went through this trauma. You may not realize it, but that trauma you went through went towards a long way to shaping your worldview and shaping how you interact with each other and how you interact within the society. As for the children of immigrants, we have our own trauma as well too. Growing up as a first-generation child of immigrant, faced many difficulties, racism, bullying, all these things. And these things all then collected inside of me to then shape my worldview. My point is that as a community, it's important that we look at ourselves as individuals and look at the means and ways that are available to us to discover ourselves. Therapy, psychotherapy, is one of those avenues that are available to us to be able to look at ourselves and to be able to examine ourselves on a very human level and to go through our personalities, go through the things and the way we react, and to be able to trace back to the sources of these things, and then with that understanding, either rectify them or evolve. Otherwise, what ends up happening is that we just repeat patterns. We end up repeating patterns over and over and over again. As a student of psychotherapy, it is mandatory for me, or it was still is mandatory for me, to attend 40 hours of personal therapy in an academic year. So that's only half the story. If I want to be very authentic with you, I will tell you that when I went for personal therapy for the first time, the therapist looked at me and said, okay, she knew I was a trainee. And interestingly, I also took on a non-Muslim therapist as well too. So, because I also wanted to discover what it was like to have therapy with a non-Muslim. What are their reactions? How do they integrate? Will they be able to understand my cultural and religious sensitivities and all that? But I'll get to that in a moment. But when I sat in the therapist's office for the first time, knowing myself and knowing all the trauma I've seen in my life, I had my father have a very, very bad accident when I was the age of 12. He got sick. Eventually, later on, he passed away. I visited the Islamic Republic of Iran in the last year of the war, and the stuff I saw there was stuff I cannot even relate. I lived in Syria during the Arab Spring. I saw an overpass blown up. I had a gun put to my head. As a teenager, I had a knife put to my throat. The list goes on. Point is, when I sat there, my therapist said to me, she said, okay, so you're a trainee, so we're going to do this, 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 and this. And I said to her, whoa, wait a minute. I said, look, I'm here in your office, and it's true, the University of Warwick has forced me to be in your office. But if I'm honest with you, I'm here because I need to be here. I'm here because I want to be here. I want to be here to be able to sit here and explore my very real human experiences and to explore the things that I've been through and to understand myself better, to understand why I think a certain way, to understand why I behave a certain way, to understand why I react a certain way. So I've been in therapy since last year, and it's been, alhamdulillah, it's been a very good experience. Very good experience so far, and I've discovered a lot about myself. My colleagues and my friends and my family will also tell you that they've also seen the change in me as well too, in terms of how I am as a person. So I would encourage every one of you, because again, going back to the narration, and I'm focusing on psychotherapy because that's my field. But the point is that there is a horizon of possibilities that are open to us when it comes to discovering about ourselves. Don't limit yourself. Again, the way we've been conditioned and raised, sometimes the only space we're told of to discover ourselves is on the musalla. Sometimes we're told the only way to practice self-discovery is to attend the center. Sometimes we're told the only way to explore and discover ourselves is to go to madrasa. What the Amir is saying here is that every avenue is open. Obviously you have the limits and the boundaries of the Sharia, but don't limit yourself. Whatever opportunity and whatever knowledge is available to you to discover yourself, I would encourage you, go for it. Psychotherapy is one of those avenues of exploration, and I can also say it's also a very good one. When we talk about therapists, going back to my therapist, the field of psychology has evolved so much. Psychology by its very name, if you break down the etymology of the word, psycho is the study of the soul, and ology is the study of it, right? And so there is a notion out there that psychology, modern psychology, psychotherapy is only concerned with the physiological factors, and that's absolutely not true. There is a perception out there that psychotherapy and psychology is not taking into consideration our reality, which is our human soul. That also is not true. With the emergence of transpersonal psychology and strands within transpersonal psychology, like psychosynthesis, which is what I studied in my life coaching, there is room to discover and explore facets of ourselves and our soul, which is most important. So I would encourage you. The other thing about modern psychotherapy today is the idea of integration. So, me, as a psychotherapist, I integrate whatever is important to me, whatever I feel is important and I can bring to the table as a psychotherapist. And at the top of my list is my faith. So I am allowed to integrate my faith into my practice. And it's important I integrate my faith because it's who I am. It's a very big part of my identity. And so I bring it into my therapeutic space. Conversely, as a client in visiting a psychotherapist, that integration is also available to you. You are allowed to integrate your faith. You are allowed to integrate your cultural sensitivities. You are allowed to integrate the things that are important to you. And sitting with an integrative psychotherapist, they will give you the space to be able to express these things. And they will guide you through, and they will not only guide you, they'll respect you. Many years ago, when the option of counseling and therapy came up, my answer was that, what do they know about religion? Like, they don't understand cultural sensitivities. They're going to, talk to me through my lens. I can tell you it's simply not true. It is a myth. Yes, if you want a Muslim practitioner, there are very good Muslim practitioners out there. Very, very good Muslim practitioners. And now we find ourselves in a very interesting place where people like myself who have a seminarian background, people like Sheikh Zuhair, who has a seminary background, are now working together with the practitioners within the community and within the Muslim world to be able to learn from each other, to be able to advise each other. And also, Sheikh Zuhair has spoken here as well too about this, about also looking at ways to perhaps even develop a new framework within this field of psychology, which is an Islamic framework based on the paradigm of Mullah Sadra. So again, therapy is just many avenues that we have available to us to learn more about ourselves on a human level, which can feed into our spiritual growth. any knowledge or any way that is available out there to learn about yourself will enhance your spiritual growth. As we are commemorating the istishhad of Imam Baqir alayhi salam, I'll close with a narration of his and a small reflection. So Imam Baqir says, no mixture is better than the mixture of clemency and knowledge. Now, those who know me know that when I look at scripture, whether it is a verse of the Quran or whether it's a narration, I first take it and reflect it on myself. And when I say reflect it on myself, not even in the external, reflect it on myself internally, right? So when I look at this narration, I say no mixture is better than the mixture of clemency and knowledge. Where does the clemency come in play? Clemency comes into play that I look at myself understanding what I am as a human being in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I act with myself with clemency. I exercise kindness and compassion to myself. The second thing is knowledge. And based on this narration, based on the narration of the Amir and other narrations, I reflected on myself and I say, that knowledge that is successful for me is the knowledge of myself. So whatever knowledge I can pursue that will lead to self-awareness of myself, I pursue it. Please recite a salawat. Assalamu alayka ya Imam al-Huda. Assalamu alayka ya Badr al-Duja. Assalamu alayka ya Kahf al-Taqwa. Assalamu alayka ya Qaida Ahl al-Taqwa. Assalamu alayka ya Baqir ilm al-Nabiyyin. Assalamu alayka ya Zayn al-Samawati wal-Ardeen. Ala la'natullahi ala al-qawm al-zalimin. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Wassalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We have a few minutes before Maghrib, so if there are any questions on either side.
Hey, Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. Thank you for the talk.
Salam. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good, good.
A couple of things. So the first one is you talk about trauma and the various types of trauma, and I understand you reference some things that are traumatic. We understand those. Are the rest of them not just life experiences that shape us, both good and bad, that drive how we behave in our everyday life?
It's a good question. There are life's experiences that do shape us and basically lead to good and bad. But the thing is, those experiences, especially the negative ones, they have an effect on us. And what I'm saying is this: is that if the space is there, or if look, first of all, you have to feel that it perhaps could be an issue, and perhaps you might not even know it's an issue. There's two ways, right? Is to be able to go back and look at those particular instances in life, and to be able to connect them to your present. Be able to connect them to your present in how you and their role in how you are as a person today. Because look, when we look at ourselves, when we look at the mirror, I mean, I speak for myself. When I look in the mirror, I'm not satisfied with the 100% of myself that I'm looking at. I'm striving to get better. So in getting better, one of the things is to look at my life's experiences, is to look at my life's experience, is to look at how I behave now, and look at how my life will play out in the future. And those are things worth exploring because at the end of the day, it's all in the spirit of trying to better ourselves. Does that make sense?
It does. So then one question on that, sorry if do you have a practical kind of reflective practice that we can do in terms of when you say, when I look upon those events or things? Not everyone's going to use those opportunities to go to therapy for those, but any type of kind of personal reflective practice that you think would be good?
I think it begins with, look, everybody knows themselves. Everybody knows what good habits they have. Everybody knows what bad habits they have, what they like about themselves, what they don't like about themselves. So perhaps a good starting point is to just pick one thing. That, you know what, I, Muhammad Mashal, don't like one thing about myself, right? And read about it, explore it, sit with it, contemplate over it. Where perhaps might this thing be coming from? And then from there, you can make a decision then. It's not, therapy are of many shapes and sizes and many forms. You don't necessarily have to go to a psychotherapist, as an example. You can do yoga. You can go and sit and do meditative practice. There are many things available. The options today are unlimited in the field of therapy and counseling. So this is what I would advise on a practical level. Just start with one thing. Just start with one thing that perhaps you don't necessarily like about yourself, unless you like everything about yourself.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Thank you for the talk. My question was maybe perhaps a bit tangential, but you mentioned at the end in terms of looking at yourself with clemency and having love and kindness towards yourself. My experience growing up and maybe my view of how Islam is taught to me is that you are supposed to constantly perhaps criticize yourself, or you have the blaming soul, the nafs al-lawama, which is constantly blaming. So perhaps there's some kind of contradiction there. Maybe not, but that's something that comes to mind when we think about self-compassion and self-kindness. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the way we've been conditioned, it's for those of you who speak Gujarati, it's mari mari ne Musalman banao, right? Like it's constant. Either you get beaten, or if you're not getting beaten, then you're beating yourself up. You understand? This is the way we've been conditioned. In terms of the point about the nafs al-lawama, the nafs al-lawama begins to blame after the nafs al-amara has acted. So it's not a situation where the nafs al-lawama is constantly, blaming yourself. That constant blame is something different from the nafs al-lawama. The nafs al-lawama is directly tied to acting on the nafs al-amara. But the thing is that, again, it comes down to the way we've been conditioned. It comes down to the way we've been raised as well too, right? And bless our parents, our grandparents, and our forefathers. This is the way they taught us how to interact with religion. But the thing is, in looking at ourselves with clemency, in going back to the discussion on the fitrah, there is no mercy greater than having a fitrah. There is no mercy greater than having that attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is through the fitrah, it is through that fitrah that it is through that fitrah and it is through the mercy that connection continues, gets maintained, and through that we're able to expand and awaken our fitrah more through our virtues and through the things that we do. Look, in life, mistakes, we all make mistakes. The baseline is that we all are going to make mistakes. We all going to sin on a level. But at the end of the day is we have to go through a process, and the process is that first to recognize the mistake, secondly is to take accountability for that mistake, and third is to look to our Lord and say, Allah, you know what, I made a mistake. And Allah is not, if you go through that process, Allah is not going to look at you and say, you know what, you did that, I'm going to take you and toss you in the fire. That's just not the way Allah operates. Does that make sense?
Sorry, but just to counter that in a sense, we have many of our du'as where we address ourselves in very, perhaps, what I would say, maybe demeaning ways, or in a way to make ourselves very lowly before Allah. And that also, in a sense, perhaps can lead to a sense of being, a bad person, constantly, blaming yourself.
It's not. You see, the du'as. So I have a theory on the du'as. The du'as that have been made available to us from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam are of many different shapes and sizes, right? We tend to focus on the ones that really take us to task, but we should not limit ourselves to only those du'as as well too. We should explore the du'as that also are not. See, there's even those du'as, I would say, is for us to simply recognize what Mullah Sadra says, our poverty in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the reality is we are impoverished in front of Allah. We are nothing without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's not for us to stay in that place. Because even if you look at the du'as where the imams are talking about, they're actually reprimanding us, it's not a matter. See, sometimes there's a conflation made. There's a point of understanding ourselves in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and understanding our poverty. And then there's another matter of self-deprecation. And I think, again, the way these du'as are framed to us is we kind of go down the road of self-deprecation. Allah doesn't want you to self-deprecate. The thing is, if Allah honored insan by making him the greatest of his creation, putting the greatest of things, the intellect inside of us, then we also have an honor in front of Allah. Does that make sense? The du'as as a whole, like I say these in my classes, that all the du'as collection as a whole, they are blueprints for different buildings. You understand? So you have to look at these blueprints and look at yourself and say, okay, what kind of building do I want to build today? Do I want to build a house in the garden? Do I want to build a skyscraper in the city? And then you take that blueprint and you apply it in that time. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry, but it's Maghrib time. There are other people who have questions, but inshallah you're still around afterwards.
Still around,
and so you can get quizzed afterwards by everyone, inshallah. So thank you very much. Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.